If a building is on fire, how long does it take the average person to start evacuating? If you said immediately, that's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people killed. The real answer is somewhere between 3 and 7 minutes, not because people can't move, not because the exits are blocked, because the human brain needs 3 to 7 minutes to accept that the building is actually on fire. During those minutes, people do things that seem completely irrational from the outside. They finish emails, they gather personal belongings, they call friends to ask if they should leave, while the building fills with smoke. This is not stupidity. This is a feature of your operating system. And it's been killing people for as long as humans have existed. Remember those doctors from the first video, the ones who were absolutely certain they were helping while poisoning their patients with mercury. Turns out they weren't uniquely stupid. They were running the same software you are. Today, we're going to talk about that software, specifically the parts of it that are actively trying to get you killed. Your brain is roughly 300,000 years old. It was designed, or more accurately, it evolved to keep you alive on an African savanna where the main threats were large predators, poisonous plants, and other humans with sharp rocks. It did a spectacular job. You're here, which means your ancestors survived. But the operating system hasn't been updated since. The hardware got better, bigger prefrontal cortex, better language processing, but the core survival firmware still running Savannah protocols. And a lot of those protocols are not just outdated, they're actively dangerous in the modern world. Bug number 1, normalcy bias. This is the big one. This is the bug that has the highest kill count. Normalcy bias is your brain's tendency to assume that things will continue to be normal even when all available evidence says they won't. It's not denial. Denial is an active choice to reject information. Normalcy bias is your brain simply failing to register that the situation has changed. The software's logic is simple. I have been in this building 1,000 times and nothing bad has happened. Therefore, nothing bad is happening now. The smoke is probably a drill. The noise was probably construction. The alarm is probably a test. Your brain runs this calculation automatically, below conscious awareness, and it takes real concrete, undeniable evidence. Fire you can feel, water you can see, rising, a wall that is no longer there, to override it. The most studied example is the World Trade Center evacuation on September 11, 2001. After the first plane hit the North Tower, researchers found that the average time to begin evacuating was approximately 6 minutes. Some people waited significantly longer. They shut down computers. They made phone calls. They gathered files. One survivor described returning to his desk to finish an email. The building had been hit by a commercial airliner, and his brain's priority was inbox zero. During the 2011 tsunami in Japan, coastal residents in some towns had up to 30 minutes of warning. Sea walls were being overtopped. Sirens were blaring. Some people drove toward the coast to check on their boats. Normalcy bias said, "We've had tsunami warnings before, and nothing happened. This time, something happened." The uncomfortable truth about normalcy bias is that it's not a malfunction. On the savannah, it was useful. If you panicked every time something unusual happened, a strange noise, an unexpected shadow, you'd waste enormous amounts of energy on false alarms. The brain evolved to default to "it's probably fine," because most of the time it was probably fine. The problem is that we now live in a world where buildings catch fire, tsunamis hit coastlines, and planes fly into towers. And the firmware that says "it's probably fine" doesn't have an exception handler for underscore, quote underscore 3, underscore, but normalcy bias only kicks in when the bad thing is already happening. The next bug is worse. It kicks in before anything happens at all. Here's a question. You know the statistics on car accidents, lung cancer, heart disease. You know the numbers. Do you feel like those numbers apply to you personally? If you're honest, no, you don't. That's optimism bias, and it might be more dangerous over a lifetime than any other bug on this list. Optimism bias is your brain's conviction that bad things are statistically less likely to happen to you than to other people. Not zero, less likely. Smokers who know the lung cancer statistics will estimate their personal risk as lower than average. Drivers who know the accident statistics will estimate their personal risk as lower than average. The data says 1 in X. Your brain says, yes, but I'm different. This isn't arrogance, it's architecture. Studies using brain imaging have shown that when people receive information that's better than expected, quote 5, the brain updates its model immediately. When they receive information that's worse than expected, your risk is actually higher. The brain barely updates at all. The hardware literally processes good news and bad news through different circuits. Good news gets a software patch. Bad news gets sent to spam. The survival value of this on the savannah was significant. An optimistic hunter who believed he could take down the mammoth was more likely to try, more likely to lead, more likely to pass on his genes. A pessimistic hunter who accurately assessed the risks would sit in the cave and, statistically, contribute less to the gene pool. Evolution selected for overconfidence, which worked beautifully until overconfidence met highway speed limits. So far, these bugs have one thing in common. They happen inside your head, silently. Normalcy bias whispers, "It's fine." Optimism bias whispers, "Not you." The next one doesn't whisper anything. It takes over your body. Everyone knows about fight or flight. Almost nobody talks about the third option, which is the one your brain is most likely to actually choose: freeze. When confronted with sudden acute danger, an estimated 10 to 15% of people simply stop moving. Not by choice. Their motor system locks. Eyes open, muscles rigid, brain running at full speed, but sending no commands to the body. On the savannah, this made sense. If a predator hasn't seen you, moving is the worst possible choice. Freezing, reducing your visual signature, minimizing noise gave you the best chance of not being noticed. But a leopard scanning the bushes and an oncoming vehicle are different threat categories. Freezing in traffic is not a survival strategy. Freezing in a fire is not a survival strategy. Your brain doesn't know that. It sees a threat, can't categorize it fast enough, and defaults to the oldest, safest protocol in the library: don't move. Maybe it hasn't seen us. You'd think the obvious fix is safety equipment: helmets, seatbelts, airbags, systems designed to compensate for exactly these kinds of failures. And they work. Perfectly, in fact. The problem isn't the equipment. The problem is what your brain does the moment it knows the equipment is there. Risk compensation is the phenomenon where adding safety measures causes people to take more risks, sometimes offsetting the safety benefit entirely. When seatbelt laws were introduced, some studies found that drivers drove slightly faster and more aggressively. When ski helmets became standard, head injury rates dropped, but overall injury rates didn't because skiers took harder runs. When anti-lock brakes were introduced, drivers braked later. The brain's calculation is, I am now safer, therefore I can afford to take more risk. The math, on some level, is correct. The problem is that the brain overestimates how much safer it is and underestimates how much more risk it's taking. The safety equipment works perfectly. The human operating it adjusts their behavior until the equipment's margin of safety is consumed. Every bug so far distorts how you see the present, the fire, the risk, the threat. The next one distorts how you see evidence itself. We covered confirmation bias in the medical cures video, doctors who interpreted patient deaths as proof the treatment was working. Same bug. Different field. In 1986, engineers at NASA had data showing that the Challenger's O-ring seals failed in cold temperatures. The launch was scheduled for a cold January morning. The data was presented. The decision makers under pressure to launch looked at the same numbers and called them inconclusive. They weren't ignoring the evidence. The conclusion, "we're launching," was written before the meeting started. The brain saw the same data and produced a different answer because the answer came first. 7 crew members died 73 seconds after liftoff, which brings us to the last bug. And in some ways, the cruelest one. All the previous bugs are invisible to the person running them. Normalcy bias feels like calm. Optimism bias feels like realism. Freezing feels like nothing at all, but this one adds a layer. It makes you feel competent. Specifically, it makes the least competent people feel the most competent. In 1999, David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger at Cornell published a paper demonstrating that people with the least skill in a given area consistently overestimate their ability. The less you know about how much you don't know. In everyday life, this produces bad karaoke and overconfident social media posts. In emergencies, it produces corpses. The person most confident in their ability to survive a disaster is, statistically, the person who has done the least preparation. They have a plan. The plan is bad. They don't know it's bad because they don't know what a good plan looks like. They are absolutely certain they would evacuate immediately, swim to safety, navigate by stars, start a fire with sticks. They have never tested any of this. Their confidence is running on zero data. Meanwhile, the people who have actually trained for emergencies, first responders, military personnel, experienced outdoors people, tend to be significantly less confident. Not because they're less capable, but because training reveals exactly how many things can go wrong. Competence breeds caution. Incompetence breeds confidence. Evolution selected for confidence. And in an emergency, the person who hesitates because they understand complexity will sometimes be outrun by the person who charges forward because they don't. 6 bugs. 6 ways your brain actively works against you in the moments that matter most. The obvious question is, does knowing about them help? Partly. If you know about normalcy bias, you can pre-commit to evacuation rules. If the alarm goes off, you leave. No email, no belongings. You leave. If you know about optimism bias, you can force yourself to use base rates instead of gut feelings. If you know about freezing, you can practice stimulus response patterns. Fire alarm means feet move toward exit. No thinking required, but awareness of the bug does not patch the bug. Knowing about normalcy bias does not prevent normalcy bias. When the alarm goes off, your brain will still tell you it's probably a drill. Knowing about optimism bias does not prevent optimism bias. Your brain will still quietly adjust your personal risk downward. The bugs are not in your beliefs. They're in your hardware, and you can't update hardware with a YouTube video. What you can do is build systems that don't rely on your brain being rational in the moment. Automatic responses, pre-committed rules, physical checklists. The same thing we talked about with medicine. We didn't become smarter than the doctors who prescribed mercury. We built guardrails, peer review, double-blind studies, systems that work specifically because they don't trust individual human judgment. Your brain is a 300,000-year-old survival engine running in an environment it was never designed for. It's doing its best. Its best involves occasionally freezing you in traffic, convincing you that the fire isn't real, and making you feel confident about a plan you've never tested. The software worked on the savannah. The savannah is gone. The software isn't. So, a building is on fire. How long does it take you to start evacuating? You already know the answer. 3 to 7 minutes. And now you know why. The question is whether knowing will make that number any smaller when it's your building.